Hi, I'm Ellen Halliday, Deputy Editor of Prospect. You're about to watch the interview portion of the latest episode of the Prospect podcast with this week's special guest. For the full episode with additional discussion from Prospect Senior Editor Alona Ferber and myself, click the link in the description below to listen via your favourite podcast app. And if you'd like to read more of Prospect's award-winning journalism, visit prospectmagazine.co.uk.
Sayeeda, thank you so much for joining us today. We're delighted to have you on the podcast. At the end of September, you left the Conservative Party and you'd criticised the party in the past for Islamophobia, for not acting on Islamophobia. You'd resigned your ministerial role in response over the party's response to the war in Gaza in 2014. What made you a Conservative then but decide to leave now?
So, interestingly, I think what's been lost in the press is that I relinquished my whip in the House of Lords. I haven't left my membership of the party.
Uh-huh.
So, although I have lots of friends who've said, yippee, I'm so glad you've escaped. You've kind of left the dark side. I actually said, no, I haven't. And I had friends in the Conservative Party who were really upset and heartbroken that they thought I'd left. And so I haven't. I have relinquished my whip because there is a specific matter I'm trying to deal with. But I remain a member for now. And I think for me, is it easy being a Conservative? Of course not. Am I an irritant for many of my colleagues? Most likely. But I do think that at this quite difficult and dangerous time in our country's history, that the largest party and the most established party in the country has to continue to have, at all times, when it loses its way, a moral conscience. And I am a Conservative. I'm a centre-right politician. I look at many of the things that my colleagues are saying now, and they do not, to me, appear to be Conservative values. If you think about the three things you could absolutely say about a Conservative government, whether you liked or loathed Conservative governments, we were supposed to be the party of sound money, the party of law and order, and the party of patriotism. And here we are, having crashed the economy, having started to have a battle on the issues of rule of law, wanting to come out of the European Convention on Human Rights, attacking judges, and playing culture wars, which is dividing our country, and patriots don't divide and set fire to their own nations.
So you resigned the whip now, particularly because of the confluence of those things?
I resigned the whip because I'm dealing with a specific issue at the moment. There was a complaint that was put into the party, and the matter was going to be dealt with behind closed doors. And I wasn't prepared to do that. I think that these issues are important and they have to be dealt with transparently. And I wanted to deal with it transparently. And I felt that the easier way to do that was to relinquish the whip.
So you're still a member of the wider Conservative Party. But you've spoken a lot in the past and in the book about your concerns about Islamophobia within the Conservative Party when it was in government and more widely. So what makes you feel that the Conservative Party is still a place where you can make a difference and where you belong?
I think there are two parts to this. Islamophobia, anti-Muslim racism in politics isn't just an issue for the Conservative Party. It's a big issue for the Conservative Party, but it's also an issue for the Labour Party. And it's also an issue with the Liberal Democrats. I've spoken to colleagues in all political parties who are concerned about their party's lack of understanding of Muslim communities, the language that is being used and the way that they are engaged or not being engaged with. And so, the issue of anti-Muslim racism isn't just found in right spaces, it's found in the left of politics. It's often found in the most liberal of spaces where you least expect it to. And I talk about that in the book, that this isn't just something that you find in the dark spaces of the far right. This is found, most dangerously in those places where you expect racism to be challenged. But I think from an ideological perspective, my politics are centre-right. And is there a political party out there now who represents what I would consider to be a one nation vision, a centre-right, small tax, big society, believe in individual kind of freedom, civil liberties? I don't think that party exists out there, but overall, the space, I couldn't find myself comfortable in other political parties.
We'll go back more to what's happened on the right in a minute. But first of all, for listeners who may not have read the book yet, Muslims Don't Matter. You've done a lot of work in your career to define Islamophobia, to get political parties behind a definition. Can we talk a little bit, first of all, about that definition and what Islamophobia looks like in practice? So could you give us a brief outline of the definition that you think kind of encapsulates what anti-Muslim racism is?
So one of the things that I talk about in the book is the long history of trying to define what Islamophobia is. And this work was originally done right back in the 90s by the Runnymede Trust. And for many, many years in government, we've been trying to find an internal process to try and come to a conclusion on this matter. And government just hasn't been interested. It started off with a position, and again, I outlined this in a lot of detail in the book, that they didn't need a definition, that then they needed an agreed definition, but did nothing about getting agreement. And that's when a cross-party group of parliamentarians, Labour, Lib Dem, SNP and Conservative got together, and in a group which was headed by Wes Streeting, the now Health Secretary, and Anna Soubry, the former Conservative Veterans Minister, Armed Forces Minister, we did this piece of work where we tried to find a definition. And after about a period of 18 months, the definition that came back was that Islamophobia is a form of racism. It's rooted in racism, which targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. Tan Desi, the Member of Parliament for Slough, the Labour Member of Parliament for Slough, who is Sikh, was a big part of the work in this. Perceived Muslimness was a big part of the definition because so many of the Islamophobic attacks are directed at Sikhs or directed at Gurdwaras, for example. So the definition came back. We engaged with government on that. And we were quite open to saying this is a starting point. This is a working definition. Work with us. Let's try and find one that would be accommodated within government. But unfortunately, for years and years, there has just been this wall of silence from the government. They tried to pretend they were going to find their own definition, and they appointed an independent advisor, and then, didn't engage with him, didn't give him any resource, didn't give him even terms of reference.
We're talking, of course, about the past Conservative government.
The past Conservative government, and then unceremoniously dismissed him by putting a letter out in the press. So I think this work has been a long time coming. The APPG definition is a starting point. It's a working definition, as is the definition of anti-Semitism. It's a non-legally binding working definition. And it's good to see that the new Labour government is interested in building on that and defining it.
We want to ask you later about the Labour government. I've got to ask you now, if you just mentioned them, that we had the far right riots earlier in the summer, where there was a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment, mosques targeted, a rumor that a Muslim had killed young girls, and when the Labour government, when Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper responded that first weekend, they didn't talk about Islamophobia or the targeting of Muslims specifically, exactly, and they were criticised by Sara Sultana MP. What did you make of their response to the riots?
Was the Labour government's response perfect? No, it wasn't. But did it actually deal with the issues? Yes, it did. I mean, I was grateful that we had a Labour government who understood these issues and was going to try and deal with these matters rather than inflame them. They were called far-right racist riots. They were called Islamophobic attacks, whether it was on day 1 or day 5. They were called what they were because it was very clear that these people were saying, we're going to go out and get some Muslims. And, we saw that people were actually, holding up cars and trying to find out whether there was a Muslim in there. People being asked for their identity. I mean, it was a really dangerous time. But the fact that the criminal justice system kicked in quickly, that these people were arrested, charged and convicted, sent the message out that this government is wanting to protect all communities in this country. So I just think that it's really important to be pragmatic about these issues. And for me, having seen how for nearly a decade, not only has very little been done in relation to anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobia in government, but actually many of my colleagues have actually fed the toxic public discourse, which has led to what we saw on our streets. I'm a little bit more confident about a government which is open to wanting to do something and open to learning and open to engaging and wanting to ensure that we take this work forward.
Coming back to your party, and you mentioned that some members of your party have helped to kind of shift the discourse and make acceptable statements that previously would not have been acceptable, also within the Conservative Party. And as part of your kind of looking back on your career within the Conservative Party, you talk about kind of the early years of Cameron's leadership and a very different norm within the leadership about talking to and talking with Muslims. So, I mean, do you see that transformation between then and now as being driven by individuals, or is this like a shift across the right? Where does that change come from?
I think what was considered to be fringe voices during the time of David Cameron have now become mainstream. So when David Cameron, if you remember his years, he described UK, probably now people who would fall within reform, as fruitcakes, loonies and closet racists. People who now the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, stood at the dispatch box and said, these are mainstream voices. So I think what happened was that what was considered to be fringe and slightly lunatic and slightly crazy and very racist under a Cameron government eventually started to become what was seen as mainstream views. And so there was a shift, and much of that shift was driven by people within government, ideological kind of what I call ideological crusaders who wanted us to take us into this space. Some of it was fed by think tanks who now have quite deep tentacles within government and have had this kind of, there's been this axis of influence which has poisoned this debate. And I think is still damaging a Labour government because these people remain in government and are trying to undermine much of the positive work that's now trying to be done. Editorial headlines, the way in which Muslims are spoken about, which then has an impact on polling, which then has an impact on what we saw on our streets. This has been a very, very long time coming, and unfortunately, some of my colleagues have played their part in taking us to that point.
When you say it's still in government, you're talking about civil servants who have
political appointments that were made during the time of the Conservative government, deliberately political appointments that were made, which now remain within government, political appointments which were completely inappropriate for the roles that they were given. But these were ideological appointments being made because the government wanted to pursue a particular kind of ideology at the heart of government. But these people remain now within government in these roles, and unfortunately, I think until these people are eventually moved out, and there is a clearing of this rot that had set in, it will be difficult to make progress on some of these issues.
In the book, you talk not just about Islamophobia in politics, but you mentioned there think tanks, and also you talk about the media and how journalists tell stories and report news about Muslims. What do journalists get wrong, and in which direction do you think the industry is moving in that sense?
I'm a lawyer. I'm a politician. I love debate. I love discussion. I come from a family of great storytellers, and I think it's great to be able to sit down and have a great old conversation and have disagreement on that. In fact, even within the Islamic tradition, there's a great tradition of disagreement and discussion. I think for me, it's about, is the conversation that you're having in a genuine spirit of learning, or is it an ideological battle in which you're trying to prove that one particular community, through demonizing it and stigmatizing it and stereotyping it, is the other? And Professor Tariq Madood, who's a professor at the University of Bristol, actually lays out a really helpful test, a 5-stage test of what a conversation can become, and the answer to these questions that he lays out, and they're in the book, explain whether or not a conversation is actually Islamophobic or whether or not it's actually a genuine conversation. I lay out a really simple test. I always say, replace what you're saying about Muslims with another community and see if it still feels comfortable. And if it doesn't, the chances are it's anti-Muslim racism. If it doesn't feel comfortable to say that about, the gay community or the Jewish community or the Roma community or whoever it may happen to be, then the chances are it's not a great thing for you to be saying about Muslim communities. So I think that, the one thing that, if anything, over the last 12 months, David Baddiel and I have shown in our podcast, A Muslim and a Jew Go There, is how the most difficult of conversations against the most difficult of backdrops at a time when relationships between Jews and Muslims have been the most strained that I have ever known, we managed to find a way in which we could have civilized conversation, which was civilizing. We managed to find a way in which we could disagree, but still see and hear each other's humanity. And I think if you're prepared to do that, why shouldn't we be having these very difficult conversations? But that's not the way in which these conversations are happening in the newspapers. If they were, there wouldn't be libel case after libel case after libel case and correction after correction after correction, which so many newspapers have to issue. And again, in my book, I detail those establishments, those magazines, those newspapers that have had to be investigated and have had to apologize and pay damages over and over again, including to me. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the point, that actually if you are getting it wrong so many times, then there's something wrong with you rather than the conversation that you're having.
Or rather than everybody else in the world is wrong, kind of, and I'm right, which kind of doesn't make much rational sense. We wanted to just before we wanted to ask you more a little bit about what you and David Baddiel kind of, how the lessons you've learned from those conversations. But first of all, I think it would be great to get a more of a sense for listeners of your experience as a Muslim British woman of Islamophobia. You talk in the book about all sorts of examples of kind of manifestations of anti-Muslim racism, but you also talk about your family having a plan B for leaving the country because there's a sense of being unsafe in the country that your sisters were born in or your parents immigrated to. Can you talk to us a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, I think I suppose it was a trigger for the book. Back in February, my husband and I started talking about how difficult things were, how the last 12 months the rhetoric had become so toxic, and we'd seen the rise of people starting to take to the streets in terms of some of the protests we were seeing from the far right. And I said to him that my I'm one of 5, and 3 of my siblings have started to look at other places. They've bought places where they could go to if things got difficult. They're sanctuary homes, as I call it. And my husband and I have always said, this is such a daft thing to do. Why would you do that? Why would you invest in something like that? You're never going to live there. That's not a place that could be home. And I have friends who are buying in all sorts of places around the world, Dubai or Istanbul or, KL, Kuala Lumpur. So many places around the world where people are thinking that this could be an alternative place. People migrating to Canada or New Zealand. And I said to him, do you think we should look to buy? And then we started saying, well, if it got really tough, how quickly do you think we'd have to move? And what do you think we could take with us? And I said to him, I've spoken to Jewish friends who say that diamonds are always a great thing that you can move quickly and move with, and then it's something you can start with. And I said, are we stupid to be buying ISAs? Should we be buying diamonds? And I think that was the moment where we then just sat in silence, having coffee at Nostell Priory. I still remember the conversation. And it hit me that I was scared in my own country. And I suppose that's where, as my kids would call it, I started journaling. I started journaling my feelings and my hurt, my anger, and used that as a moment to sound the sirens to, ordinary, decent British people, to say, this is bad for Muslims, but this is bad for the rest of you as well. All of us have to find a way in which we have to push back against this kind of ethno-nationalism and bordering on fascism, which we're now beginning to see. And this is how it starts. And are we going to be those crazy Muslims, like so many of my Jewish friends say, they had ancestors and families who were sat there in Europe in 1920s and 30s and saying, stop being so ridiculous, it will never get that bad.
Yeah.
Are we going to be that family? Whereas my siblings are going to be the families that got out. And when you start thinking in those terms, and remember, I'm the granddaughter of 2 men who served in the British Indian Army. I'm the mother of a child who's in uniform protecting our country right now. When you hit that moment, when you think we have 4 generations of my family have in some way protected, built this country, and I no longer feel protected in it. So I really hope the book is the start of a conversation. I'm urging people to come to it with an open mind. It's 150 pages. It was written in 12 weeks.
That's impressive.
It was, it was real time. And I literally finished the book and then the riots happened. So I kind of went back and reflected those riots in the book. It is tragically timely. It is short, and the Yorkshire woman in me says, it's the cost of a pizza. If nothing else, just pick up the book and engage with it. And then use that as a moment to have a conversation. Speak to friends, family, colleagues. Don't let this be just a kind of book. I want it to be a living, breathing instrument for good conversation.
You say in the book, you say 2 things that really struck me. One, you say I'm a politician who happens to be a Muslim, but everybody sees me as a Muslim who happens to be a politician, who happens to be other things. And you also say, you're in your 50s, you were an activist in your 20s, you didn't expect to still be dealing with issues like this now. Do you think that the way that you feel in these conversations that you've had in your family, are these conversations that British Muslims are having in general? Do you have a sense that there's a sense that the British Muslim community has reached a kind of breaking point with this kind of the rhetoric and the demonization?
I'm finding this conversation really difficult. It's exhausting.
I'm sorry.
This has been so many years in the making. And I've got to the point where, people should be able to wake up every morning and live their lives in a way where they embrace the good. That actually so much energy should not be taken looking over your shoulder. And now in my 50s, I've had the privilege, I am privileged. I have the privilege of position and platform. I have the privilege of having been a successful product of social mobility. We have, a wonderful home, a wonderful family. And right now, we should be just looking at our grandchildren as we do and think, what a great future for them. And instead, we are planning exit routes for them. And we are encouraging them to find alternative places. And we say things like, well, if it got really bad, X, Y, and Z would go there, A and B would go here. What would we do with, this member of the family? And it feels exhausting and tiring. And we have 2 options. We are privileged enough to be able to say, we're done. We're done, we're packing up, we're moving away, and we're going to find a nice little island somewhere and have a nice little life. But that would be running away. And if those of us who have the privilege of platform and a voice and financial independence and all that goes with that, do not fight for our rightful place in our country, who am I going to leave it to? So, yes, I'm tired of having this fight. I don't want to have this fight. Now in my 50s, there are things I would rather be doing, but I cannot guarantee that my future generations will be safe in their home. And that's why I'm urging people to engage. We have to have a conversation and we have to find a better way. And after years and years of hate, this country needs to find a way to heal itself.
The process of that healing, of course, is not only something that the British Muslim community should be involved in, but all of our listeners to this podcast as well. So, I mean, going forwards, how would you encourage them to be part of that process?
I mean, we're taking the book on the road. I'm encouraging people to come along. I say there's no question that's off limit. As long as it's done, as David and I always say, in a way that's civilized and civilizing. So much of what we saw on the streets over the summer was disinformation, misinformation, misunderstanding. And when you saw the human-to-human contact, you saw the most beautiful relationships flourish. Britain is an amazingly tolerant, liberal space. And it has and has always welcomed people that have arrived from other shores. And we mustn't allow a small group of people, powerful people, people in positions of authority, to poison it. Because in the end, that will damage all of us. So it is an all-of-community conversation that I want to have. And I hope people feel that they can join it. And already, people who are reading the book are saying, it's made me stop and think. That's all I'm asking for. Read, stop, think, reassess, speak, converse, find a way through this.
You said earlier in the conversation that you feel kind of quite optimistic or confident or hopeful about the ability of this new government under Keir Starmer to take this issue seriously and to tackle it. But there's been also evidence that Labour hasn't tackled Islamophobia and anti-Black racism within the party. So, for example, the Ford report, its author, after it was published in 2020, its author spoke about the fact that it wasn't taken as seriously by Labour, for example, as the issue of anti-Semitism. Do you think that Labour now is equipped to tackle Islamophobia more broadly in society if it sort of hasn't managed to deal with it within the party?
I think they've had some very turbulent years. I think they've got much wrong. They've got some things right. But certainly from the conversations that I'm having with colleagues in Labour, there's definitely a desire to get this right. And there's definitely an acknowledgement after what they saw on the streets in the summer that this is urgent. And for me, this is not a party political issue. It's actually fighting for the very future and the soul of what this country will become. The Muslims might be the first ones at the receiving end of it. We might be the canaries in the coal mine, but that's not where it stops. And that's why I'm urging, members of other communities as well to say that we all need to come together, that this isn't a zero-sum game. It isn't one community against the other, that the weaponization of racism, as it has been done in politics, has got to stop, and that we have to find a way of realizing that, my rights are not diminished if your rights are given. And at the moment, I have to be hopeful and optimistic, and certainly from the conversations that I've had so far, I think there's a real desire to move in the right direction.
Well, Sayeeda, thank you so much for spending this time with us today and talking us through your book, which is, a really insightful, fierce book that talks about your experiences, and I think will give a lot of listeners a kind of new perspective on events of the past government, this government, and the presence of Islamophobia across the country. So thank you very much for spending this time with us this morning. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Sorry about that, guys.
Yeah, you okay?
Yeah. I was trying to.